Let's begin with a truth that many overlook. Most people believe magnetism comes from beauty, from perfect features, or from carefully chosen words. They assume attraction lies in style, in perfume, or in the clever play of charm. But that is not where real power resides. A polished appearance can capture attention for a moment, but it cannot hold it. A mask of confidence may fool the surface, but the unconscious always sees through. True presence does not shout, it radiates. And that radiance does not come from what we display, but from what we have integrated. Carl Jung once wrote that what remains repressed governs us, but what we integrate becomes our strength. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now notice how often people confuse effort with magnetism. They try to impress, to prove, to persuade. Yet the more they chase, the more the energy feels restless, and restlessness never attracts. It is the quiet steadiness of someone at home within themselves that draws others closer. A person who has faced their shadow, their insecurities, their unspoken fears, no longer leaks desperation. They hold it, transform it, and it becomes an aura of depth. This is why some people seem to glow without trying. Their voice may be soft, their gestures simple, but there is a density around them, a silence full of presence. You feel there are layers, that you are not looking at an empty mask, but at a whole being. Magnetism is not about having more, but about needing less. It is not about the size of a gesture, but about the weight behind it. Jung understood this as individuation, the lifelong process of bringing the hidden parts of ourselves into the light. Every instinct we deny becomes a restless ghost that undermines our confidence. Every fear we face and integrate becomes fuel for our presence. The body simply expresses what the soul has resolved. And when the inner field is coherent, others sense it immediately. So the first lesson is clear. True attraction is not a performance, it is a state. It is not built on explanations, but on a gaze that holds steady even in silence. It is the refusal to adapt one's spirit just to be accepted. It is the courage to remain rooted even in discomfort. That is where curiosity begins, and curiosity is the threshold of desire. Attraction always begins with an illusion. Many people believe that if they can arrange the surface just right, the rest will follow. They polish their appearance, rehearse their words, even manage their gestures as if life were a stage. Yet beneath the performance, something fragile trembles. This is the first fracture, the point where outer display and inner reality begin to separate. What seems bright on the surface begins to crack when the unconscious, ignored, and unsettled reveals itself. Consider how often someone tries to impress with endless talking. The silence feels dangerous, so they rush to fill it. They over-explain, overshare, overreach. What they seek is approval, but what radiates is unease. Jung reminded us that the unconscious does not remain silent. It speaks in tone, in posture, in the subtle dissonance between what is said and what is actually carried within. And when others sense that gap, attraction fades. The fracture deepens when desire itself is misunderstood. Desire is not the enemy, It is energy waiting to be directed. Yet many approach it with fear or with grasping need. They believe that to win love, they must chase hurry and secure answers. In doing so, they reveal dependence rather than strength. A person who clings or rushes unknowingly shows that they are not whole, and the human psyche is drawn not to incompleteness, but to coherence. This is why a mask cannot hold. The persona, that social face each of us wears, has value in the world. It allows us to work to connect, to play roles. But when the persona becomes confused with the self, we lose balance. Jung called this inflation, when the mask pretends to be the whole. The fracture occurs when the persona shines outward, but the shadow filled with fear, resentment, or insecurity leaks beneath it. No amount of surface charm can cover that dissonance for long. You can see it in subtle ways. A smile that feels too practiced. A laugh that comes too quickly. A gesture that repeats itself until it feels mechanical. Others may not name what is wrong, but they feel it in their body. The field of energy loses harmony. What should invite curiosity now pushes people away. The effort to appear magnetic becomes paradoxically repulsive. The deeper tragedy is that many never realize why. They assume they must try harder polish, more control, even tighter. They look to the body, the wardrobe, the lines rehearsed before a mirror. Yet they ignore the one place magnetism is born. The unconscious field, the integration of what lies within. And so the fracture grows. Think of a woman who fears being unseen. She enters a room determined to shine. Her voice rises, her movements become larger than life. Yet within, she doubts her worth. She cannot rest in silence. The persona commands attention, but the unconscious radiates insecurity. Those who meet her may notice her effort, but they do not feel drawn to stay. The fracture between mask and energy becomes too wide to bridge. Jung's insight was simple but uncompromising. What is repressed does not disappear. It controls us. The shadowed emotions, the unresolved complexes, the forgotten instincts all continue their work. If they are ignored, they break through in ways that disturb connection. If they are faced, they become fuel for depth. This is the choice presented by the first fracture: to cover it with more masks, or to turn inward and begin integration. Attraction fades most quickly when neediness takes the lead. A person who must constantly prove their value signals that they doubt it themselves. Silence becomes unbearable. Absence feels like abandonment. Every gesture is forced. In that state, even kindness loses weight, for it carries the vibration of fear. Magnetism requires tension, the ability to hold impulse without collapse. But the fractured self cannot hold. It leaks. The cost of living from fracture is heavy. Relationships become unstable, filled with confusion and misread signals. One moment seems full of promise, the next collapses into disappointment. The unconscious patterns repeat: clinging, performing, over-explaining, apologizing. Each attempt to secure love only widens the gap. And behind it all lies a deeper wound: the fear of being unwanted if one does not perform. This is where Jung's idea of individuation begins to touch real life. For individuation is not a luxury, it is a necessity. To live only from the mask is to live in fracture. To refuse the shadow is to remain divided. The world may see a polished surface, but the unconscious knows the truth. And what the unconscious knows always finds its way into the field of attraction. Many ask why some people seem magnetic without effort. The answer is that they are not fractured. They have faced enough of themselves to remain steady in discomfort. They can hold silence without collapsed desire, without haste presence, without overexposure. They may not be flawless, but their energy is whole. Others feel this wholeness as coherence, as harmony, as depth. So the first fracture is not a punishment, but a signal. It reveals where the persona has overreached, where the shadow demands recognition. To notice it is the beginning of wisdom. To ignore it is to live in endless repetition. Magnetism fades. Relationships falter, and the soul grows restless. The fracture is a mirror, and it asks, will you continue to polish the mask, or will you begin to restore the self? The fracture we explored earlier does not vanish on its own. It becomes a battlefield between two forces inside every human being. On one side stands the persona, the carefully built mask of social identity, the polished face we show the world. On the other side lives the shadow, the unspoken fears, hidden desires, and rejected parts of the self. These two do not simply coexist. They wrestle for control, and their conflict radiates into every relationship. When the persona grows too strong, it convinces us that adaptation is safety. We smile when we feel sorrow. We agree when we long to refuse. We rush to please when silence would serve us better. Outwardly, everything appears stable. Inwardly, energy drains away. The price of wearing the mask is disconnection from the self and from the authentic bond we might share with others. Yet the shadow will not stay buried. It slips through in subtle ways. It appears in restless eyes, in gestures too sharp, in words repeated without conviction. Even when we try to suppress it, the unconscious makes itself known. Jung warned that whatever remains unconscious will direct our life, and we will call it fate. This is why repeated patterns emerge, the same disappointments, the same fragile connections, the same sense of being unseen despite all effort. Think of the dance between desire and fear. The persona whispers, if you give more, if you adapt faster, you will be loved. The shadow whispers, you are not enough and you must cling to survive. Neither voice holds truth, yet both demand obedience. The result is exhaustion. Presence collapses into performance. Love becomes negotiation. Attraction withers under the weight of insecurity. What makes this struggle so costly is the illusion that the persona protects us. We believe that by pleasing, performing, and adapting, we can secure safety. But true connection does not come from denial. It comes from coherence, and coherence requires facing the shadow. Without this, the fracture grows until the mask becomes brittle, and the self beneath feels trapped and unseen. Magnetism thrives in tension, the ability to hold impulse without rushing to remain steady in silence. But the fractured self cannot hold. The persona seeks approval too quickly, while the shadow floods with fear. Together, they create a rhythm of approach and collapse desire and retreat hope and disappointment. This repeating cycle leaves behind not depth, but confusion. The stakes are high for this struggle, shapes not only attraction, but identity itself. Every time we betray our truth to keep the mask intact, we move further from individuation. We abandon the journey toward wholeness and settle for performance. Yet the unconscious remembers. It knows what has been denied, and it sends reminders in the form of dreams, in restless moods, in sudden waves of longing that no surface success can quiet. Consider how silence feels different depending on inner state. A woman who has faced her shadow can sit in stillness, and that silence radiates strength. But if her shadow rules, unacknowledged silence becomes unbearable. She must fill it with noise, reassurance, or empty gestures. To the outside world, both moments look alike. To the unconscious, they could not be further apart. This is why Jung spoke of the shadow as essential. Not because it is pleasant, but because it carries the missing pieces of the self. To deny anger, fear, or longing is to deny energy itself. To face them is to recover vitality. When a person refuses to look inward, they live fractured, repeating patterns of pursuit and collapse. When they dare to integrate, they begin to radiate depth. The mask may promise acceptance, but it cannot create intimacy. Only the integrated self can do that. For when persona and shadow are at war, others sense the dissonance. But when they are acknowledged and held together, others sense harmony. Attraction grows where energy is whole. This inner struggle is not failure. It is the necessary stage on the path to transformation. The mask and the shadow must confront one another. One must stop pretending to be the whole, and the other must step out of exile. This confrontation is painful, for it strips away illusions. But without it, there is no true magnetism, only endless repetition. The world is filled with people who perform tirelessly, yet remain unseen. They ask, "Why am I not chosen? Why do my efforts fail?" The answer lies not in doing more, but in being more. The shadow must be brought into the light, not hidden behind the mask. Jung saw individuation as the journey through this very conflict, a process where the false self weakens and the true self begins to emerge. So here in this struggle between shadow and persona lies the heart of the human drama. Will we cling to the surface mask, exhausting ourselves with performance, or will we turn inward, face the shadow, and begin to reclaim our wholeness? This is the question the fracture demands, and it is the question that sets the stage for awakening. The struggle between mask and shadow cannot last forever. At some point, the tension itself begins to reveal its secret. What once felt like conflict begins to whisper of possibility. The shadow, when faced, does not destroy. It transforms. The persona, when humbled, does not vanish. It softens into a useful servant rather than a false master. This is the beginning of awakening, not a dramatic event, but a quiet reorientation of energy. Jung saw this moment as the first movement toward individuation. Individuation is not perfection. It is not becoming someone entirely new. It is becoming whole, learning to live without denying the parts of yourself that frighten you. To awaken is to discover that desire is not a curse to be suppressed, nor a tyrant to be obeyed. Desire is raw material. Like fire, it can burn recklessly, or it can be held with reverence, providing warmth and light. The person who awakens begins to sense this difference. She notices that silence no longer feels unbearable. Waiting no longer feels like failure. The urge to prove, to explain, to conquer begins to fade. Instead, she learns to remain steady, to let curiosity grow in others, rather than flooding them with need. This steadiness is not coldness, it is fullness. The one who awakens is no longer frantic for validation, because she has touched something deeper inside herself. Awakening is marked by a shift in rhythm. The fractured self moves in haste, desperate to secure closeness, to make something happen. The awakening self learns to move in cadence with life. Approach is balanced by retreat. Touch is balanced by restraint. Words are balanced by silence. Jung called this the tension of opposites, the ability to hold two forces without collapse, and to let transformation arise from that very tension. It is here that magnetism begins to take on its true form. Attraction is no longer about strategy or display. It becomes a field of presence, shaped by someone who has learned to carry her energy with intention. A gaze can linger without threat. A silence can deepen connection, rather than fracture it. A simple gesture can carry more weight than endless explanation. Others feel the coherence. They sense the steadiness. They lean closer without quite knowing why. Awakening also means discovering the symbolic nature of energy. The unconscious speaks in symbols, and so does magnetism. A pause before a word becomes a door left half open. A gesture withheld becomes a mystery that stirs imagination. What is not revealed outright becomes more powerful than what is shown. The awakened self understands that fascination does not come from giving everything, but from leaving space for others to project, to imagine, to complete the picture themselves. This is why awakening feels like alchemy. Raw impulse is refined into presence. Restlessness is transformed into gravity. The self that once leaked insecurity now radiates density. The shadow is no longer an enemy. It becomes a source of depth, a reminder that wholeness includes the hidden as much as the visible, and the persona is no longer brittle. It becomes flexible, a mask that can be worn without losing the truth beneath. One of Jung's most powerful ideas was synchronicity, the mysterious alignment of inner and outer worlds. The awakened self begins to notice this in relationships. Timing shifts. Words seem to arrive at the right moment. A touch is offered at the precise instant it can be received. Silence appears exactly when it is needed. This is not manipulation. It is sensitivity. The person who has integrated their own fire can sense the emotional field of the other without being consumed by it. Awakening also brings freedom from repetition. The fractured self repeats the same patterns again and again, hoping for different results. The awakened self varies, sometimes warmth, sometimes distance, sometimes clarity, sometimes mystery. Always authentic, yet never predictable. This variety keeps desire alive because the unconscious longs for renewal. Energy that moves in spirals, not straight lines, nourishes fascination instead of numbing it. But perhaps the most profound sign of awakening is the ability to use absence with grace. The fractured self fears absence, interpreting it as rejection or punishment. The awakened self understands that absence is part of rhythm, part of depth. To withdraw with elegance is not to vanish in anger, but to trust that one's presence lingers even when one is not seen. This absence creates space for longing imagination and memory, the psychic elements of lasting attraction. Here lies the paradox of awakening. By no longer chasing one becomes sought after. By no longer clinging, one becomes unforgettable. By no longer demanding, one creates curiosity and desire. This is not arrogance, but alignment. The awakened self has shifted from need to fullness, from fragmentation to coherence. And that coherence is what the unconscious of others recognizes as magnetic. It is important to understand that awakening is not a final state. It is a process unfolding layer by layer. Each new challenge reveals more of the shadow, more of the persona that must be softened. But with each integration, presence deepens. Attraction ceases to be a strategy and becomes a natural radiance. The awakened person does not ask, "How do I impress?" but rather, "How do I remain whole in this moment?" Awakening transforms relationships. Instead of being consumed by the need to secure attention, the awakened self becomes a space where others feel both drawn and respected. Instead of demanding closeness, she invites it. Instead of fearing rejection, she trusts her own wholeness. This shift is not only felt by others, it is experienced as inner peace. The restless hunger of the fractured self quiets. The energy once spent on masks and performances now flows into authentic presence. And so the fire is mastered without being extinguished. Desire still burns, but it is no longer chaotic. It glows steadily like a hearth that warms without destroying. Magnetism becomes more than attraction. It becomes inspiration. Others do not simply want to possess the awakened self. They want to grow in her presence. Jung would say that she has become a symbol embodying what the unconscious of others longs to integrate for themselves. This is the gift of awakening. It is not about conquering bodies, but about elevating souls. It is not about securing attention, but about becoming unforgettable. It is not about erasing desire, but about transforming it into a steady radiance. To awaken is to live as both human and symbol, as both individual and archetype. It is to embody depth and to allow that depth to speak without words. Awakening is not the end of the journey, but it is the turning point. From here, choice becomes possible. Boundaries can be drawn, standards can be lived. The fractured self no longer controls the field. The integrated self begins to guide it. This is the threshold of transformation, where attraction ceases to be restless and becomes transcendent. Awakening is never complete until it is tested in action. Inner realization must become outer form, or it risks fading back into dream. This is why transformation always requires a choice. To integrate the shadow is to claim power, but to live from the self requires boundaries. It is here that individuation moves from theory into lived reality. The first choice is to stop seeking from lack. When a person has awakened to their own depth, they no longer rush to fill silence with apologies or explanations. They no longer surrender their rhythm to every demand around them. This is not arrogance, it is alignment. The individual chooses to remain centered, even when others attempt to pull them off course. In this steadiness lies the seed of magnetism. Boundaries are not walls. They are the frame that allows life to flow without collapse. Jung taught that the self contains opposites and that wholeness emerges from holding tension. A boundary is one such tension between giving and protecting, between closeness and space, between presence and absence. Without boundaries, desire becomes chaos. With them, desire becomes rhythm. The transformed self knows when to speak and when to remain silent. She knows that silence is not emptiness, but presence. She knows when to approach and when to withdraw, not out of fear, but out of trust in her own rhythm. This rhythm teaches others that her energy cannot be consumed at will. It must be respected. Respect, in turn, becomes the ground on which lasting attraction can stand. Consider how absence is used differently by the fractured self and the transformed self. The fractured self withdraws out of fear or resentment, hoping to provoke attention. The transformed self withdraws with grace, trusting that her presence lingers without being forced. One absence breeds insecurity, the other creates longing. This is the difference. Boundaries make absence becomes not punishment, but an invitation. The choice to live with boundaries also reshapes touch presence and communication. Instead of overgiving, the transformed self learns moderation. A glance, a pause, a light gesture carry more than a flood of words or actions. This moderation creates space for imagination. Desire thrives in space, not in excess. Jung said the unconscious speaks in symbols, and the restrained gesture becomes such a symbol, a door half open, a mystery awaiting completion. Transformation is marked by a new kind of confidence, not the loud confidence of boasting or display, but the quiet confidence of self-possession. Others sense it immediately. They may not know why, but they feel steadiness, coherence, depth. This draws them closer without the need for performance. The transformed self does not beg to be chosen. She chooses herself first, and in doing so, she becomes magnetic. Boundaries also free relationships from repetition. Where the fractured self once cycled through patterns of clinging, performing, and collapse, the transformed self interrupts the cycle. She refuses to accept crumbs of attention. She does not repeat gestures until they lose meaning. She introduces variation, subtle but real, reminding the unconscious of others that life is not routine but renewal. This refusal to repeat lifeless patterns keeps desire alive. At the heart of this transformation lies responsibility. Jung wrote that what we deny in ourselves, we project onto others. By choosing to integrate the shadow, the transformed self takes responsibility for her own energy. She no longer blames others for her insecurity, nor seeks to be rescued from silence. Instead, she holds her fire with elegance. This responsibility is magnetic because it communicates maturity. Others sense they are not being used as a bandage for hidden wounds. They are free to meet her as equals, not as saviors. The transformation also changes how one relates to rejection. The fractured self feared rejection as proof of inadequacy. The transformed self understands rejection as alignment, the natural sorting of energies that do not resonate. With this acceptance, she no longer chases what pulls away. She no longer dilutes herself to fit into spaces where she does not belong. This is not coldness. It is clarity. And clarity itself is deeply attractive, for it shows that one's worth is not negotiable. Boundaries make space for joy. They protect the field of energy so it can be given with generosity, not resentment. Without boundaries, every gift feels like depletion. With boundaries, giving becomes choice, and choice carries weight. This is why the transformed self can give less and yet mean more. Each gesture, each word, each touch carries intention, not compulsion. It is presence, not performance. To live this way is to embody individuation. The self has emerged as center. The persona still plays its role, but no longer rules. The shadow is no longer denied, but integrated as source of depth. Together, they create wholeness, and wholeness radiates as magnetism. Attraction becomes less about possession and more about resonance. Others are drawn not because they are manipulated, but because they feel more alive in such presence. This transformation does not erase desire. On the contrary, it intensifies it. But desire is now mastered, refined, and directed. It burns without consuming it, glows without fading. The transformed self no longer floods the field with restlessness. Instead, she warms the space with intention. Desire becomes an invitation, not a demand. This is the art of holding fire without letting it burn uncontrolled. In practical life, this means living from standards rather than from need. Standards are not rules imposed on others. They are commitments to the self. They declare what energy will be welcomed and what will not. They define how one will give and how one expects to receive. Standards ensure that relationships grow from equality, not exploitation. They transform attraction into communion because both sides are free to bring their whole selves without fear of collapse. This is the decisive boundary to stop living for approval and to start living from depth. When this choice is made, everything shifts. The restless hunger of the fractured self quiets. The need for endless performance falls away. In its place rises a calm confidence, a magnetic field that does not chase but draws. Others feel it. They sense the difference, and they respond not to the mask, but to the wholeness behind it. Transformation is not without cost. Some will resist the change. Those who once fed on neediness may withdraw when faced with boundaries. Relationships built on performance may falter, but this loss is necessary, for it clears the field of false bonds. What remains is real connection, born not from desperation, but from presence. And presence once integrated cannot be forgotten. So, transformation requires courage. Courage to hold boundaries even when others misunderstand. Courage to let go of what cannot meet the self in wholeness. Courage to live as symbol, not as mask. This courage does not shout. It radiates. It carries the weight of depth and the grace of restraint. It is the quiet strength of someone who has chosen to live from integration. And this is the essence of transformation, to move from lack to fullness, from fracture to coherence, from seeking to radiating. The choice is not simply about relationships. It is about destiny. For Jung reminded us that the unconscious shapes fate. To integrate it, to live from wholeness, is to shape fate consciously. It is to cease being a victim of patterns and to become an author of presence. This choice, this boundary marks the threshold of the final stage. From here, magnetism ceases to be merely personal. It becomes symbolic. It moves beyond attraction and into transcendence. For the integrated self is no longer just an individual. She has become a living symbol, a reminder to others of what wholeness feels like. And symbols are never forgotten. Every journey of transformation eventually arrives at stillness. After the struggle of masks, after the confrontation with shadow, after the awakening of fire held without fear, what remains is integration. The scattered energies of the self no longer compete. They form a whole. And it is this wholeness that radiates as lasting magnetism. Attraction in its raw form is fleeting. Beauty fades. Charm grows. Stale repetition dulls desire. But presence born of integration does not fade. It becomes unforgettable, not because it demands attention, but because it resonates deeply in the unconscious of others. What you have faced within yourself, the fear, the longing, the insecurity, no longer controls you. It becomes fuel. And from that fuel rises a field of depth that others feel even in your silence. This is the final shift from seeking to being, from conquering to elevating. Desire no longer drives you to chase or perform. Instead, it becomes the quiet warmth that makes others feel more alive in your presence. They do not simply want you, they want to grow near you. Jung understood this as individuation, the process where a person ceases to be a fragment and becomes a symbol of wholeness. Such a person is not remembered only for beauty or cleverness, but as an experience that lingers in the soul. Transformation is not measured in how many admire you, but in how deeply your presence leaves a trace. The unconscious does not remember perfection. It remembers symbols. A gaze that held steady without fear, a silence that did not collapse, a boundary that protected dignity. These become living symbols in the psyche of others. They appear in dreams, in longings, in the quiet memory of having been in the presence of someone whole. So, what is the lesson of this journey? That true magnetism was never about control, never about performance, never about needing to prove your worth. It was always about integration. To face your shadow instead of fleeing from it. To soften the mask without discarding its use. To hold desire without drowning in it. To move not from lack, but from fullness. In this way, Magnetism ceases to be mere attraction and becomes legacy. You no longer ask, "How do I keep someone?" You ask instead, "What do I embody that can never be forgotten?" For the soul is drawn not to surfaces, but to symbols. And when you become a symbol of depth, of steadiness, of quiet strength, you cease to be one person among many. You become the experience itself. Jung often reminded us that the unconscious shapes destiny. When you repress, the shadow dictates your path. When you integrate, you shape it consciously. This is the true work of transformation, to no longer live as a victim of hidden forces, but as a creator of meaning. And when you live this way, you carry a field that heals without trying, inspires without boasting, and attracts without chasing. This is why the final stage is not seduction, but transcendence. To seduce is to conquer the body. To transcend is to awaken the soul. And the soul never forgets what has touched it in truth. A fleeting touch may be forgotten by the skin, but the unconscious remembers the depth of presence. That memory becomes part of another's story. It shapes their longing, their dreams, their own journey toward wholeness. And so magnetism becomes more than personal. It becomes archetypal. You embody what Jung called the living symbol, the figure that carries meaning not only for yourself, but for the collective. Perhaps it is the sage calm and steady. Perhaps it is the lover warm and whole. Perhaps it is the healer whose presence brings coherence. The form may vary, but the essence is the same. You have become more than yourself. You have become a mirror for the deeper self that others are still seeking. This is where the journey closes, not in conquest, but in quiet radiance. To live from integration is to leave behind the restless hunger of the fractured self. It is to rest in the center where boundaries are clear, desire is refined, and presence is enough. This is not a performance. It is a philosophy of being. So let the final reflection be simple. You do not need to become someone else to be magnetic. You need only to integrate what you have hidden, to carry it with dignity, and to live from wholeness. In that state, you will not merely attract. You will elevate. You will not merely be remembered. You will become unforgettable. And that is the lasting legacy of individuation, to live as both human and symbol, both particular and universal. To embody depth so fully that your presence becomes a quiet medicine for those around you. This is the invitation of life, to stop performing for approval and to start radiating from truth. Take a breath here. Let these words settle like a stone sinking gently into water. Ask yourself, which part of this reflection speaks most to where you are now? The mask, the shadow, the awakening, or the wholeness? If something here has touched you, share your reflection in the comments. I'd love to know where you are listening from and what part of this journey resonates most with your own. And as you leave tonight, remember this. What you integrate becomes your radiance, and radiance once revealed cannot be forgotten.